The Legions of Athena. Chapter 10. Maximus walked towards the dining room, still very distracted from the conversation he had had last night with the voice. "Athens will fall," the voice had told him. He knew that it was not a piece of information he should take lightly. As he entered the hall, he had to put these thoughts aside though, as Rex and Mia were already there eating. Ever since his sparring session against Rex, he hadn't had a real conversation with his friends. So an awkward silence followed as he sat down. "Hey," he mumbled to them as he began to eat silently. A few minutes passed before, out of nowhere, wham! Rex just took a right swing to Max's shoulder. He fell out of his chair and landed face first on the floor. Mia gasped in surprise as well, and dropped her green goop-filled spoon. Maximus scrambled back to his feet furious and shouted, "What the hell was that for?" "Ah, so it speaks," Rex joked. "Listen here, you little numbskull. Just because you got lucky last time does not change the fact that I have beaten you more times than I can count. And more importantly, it does not change anything between us." Somehow, Max's anger didn't last after that. He knew Rex long enough to understand exactly what he meant by that. He knew what Rex meant was to quit worrying, and that they would be there for him, no matter what. But of course the hulking imbecile would never say those words. Instead, he would just punch him and talk crap. "Gah!" Max screamed. "Punch me again and we'll have a recap of our last match right now." But as he sat down again, he couldn't wipe the stupid grin off his face. "Are you guys sure you weren't in a mental asylum back in Mars?" Mia said, rolling her eyes and taking Max's spoon. "Hey, how am I supposed to eat then? You can have mine, which is lying on the floor. It's thanks to you geniuses I dropped it," Mia retorted. "So take his," Max said, pointing at Rex, who had went back to gulping down the goop. "No way. He's already slobbered all over it," Mia said. "I wouldn't be surprised if he swallowed the thing by accident." Maximus looked down at his own goop and decided that he wasn't that hungry anyway. "So Hedger's not up yet?" he asked. "Well, you won't believe it, but the past couple days that bird brain has been getting up early and heading to the library," Rex answered. "Didn't know he was such a bookworm. Still, someone has to go get him because we'll be leaving soon. The opening ceremony for the festival is in the afternoon," informed Maximus. "Well, since you're done eating," Mia hinted with a sheepish grin, and Maximus left for the library with a scowl to find Hedger. When Maximus entered the library, he didn't spot Hedger right away. His small body was hidden behind a large stack of books that easily concealed him. Hedger didn't even notice that he was there either. He was too busy staring at the computer monitor on his desk. "So I zone out just for a few days, and you turn into a crazy hermit on a reading frenzy?" Maximus joked. Hedger turned around and greeted him with a grin. "Well, look who finally showed up. We were afraid that we were only going to get to see you when you got your ass handed to you by those tyros in the tournament tomorrow." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Max retorted, lightly punching the sprite. Then he pulled up a chair and sat next to Hedger and asked, "So what's all this?" "This," Hedger said. "This is history." Maximus gaped blankly at Hedger, who was busy rummaging through the pile of books. Finally, he took out an old, thick, brown book and handed it to his friend. Maximus thought the book looked vaguely familiar. "Is this the book you found the other day?" Hedger nodded. Max flipped through the book, and there was no doubt about it. It was the same handwritten copy they had found days earlier, when he was still obsessed with finding the origin of his sword. But while his obsession ended that day, Hedger seemed to have picked one up. "So you figured out what this is?" Maximus asked. Hedger scratched his head and said, "Kind of. You remember how we thought it was a journal of some kind?" Maximus nodded for him to continue. "Well, we were right, only it belonged to someone old, and I'm talking someone who breathed during the old Titan War," Hedger said. "What?" "No way. The year is 1232A. That means the Titan War ended around 1,200 years ago, right?" Maximus asked. Hedger shook his head and said, "Well, our current timeline, GA God's Age, didn't start right after the Titan Age ended. There were about 100 years or so during which the Titan War occurred. There's not a lot of info about what happened during the war. That is why I call them the Dark Ages. Only after the Dark Ages did the God's Age, that is 1 Gramne, begin. Anyway, this journal is dated to the time of the war, so its details and language are all messed up." Maximus let out a whistle and said, "Looks like you've gotten yourself quite a hobby. So is that what you're searching on the computer now?" Hedger turned to the screen and said, "Nah, that ancient journal is nearly 1,000 pages long. Besides, they don't really let you take it out of this place. So I asked Daedalus, and he showed me how to make a digital copy using a machine at the back of this library. Once I was done with that, I thought, why stop there, and started making copies of other books I found interesting. The digital copies are on this computer right now. If they're on the computer here, how is that any better?" Maximus asked. Hedger gave him a smirk and said, "'Cause I'm going to transfer them all to this little beauty right here." He handed Maximus an electronic device that looked like a thin slate that fit in his palm, but when he touched it, the device lit up. "Is this a computer?" Hedger replied, smiling. "Well, kind of. Daedalus gave it to me as a replacement for that mobile I broke. Guess being clumsy paid off. This thing here's much more useful. Can call people on it too. It's called an e-reader. The e-reader didn't look anything like the old mobile, which had a numeric keypad and a small screen on it. This entire device seemed to be one big screen. It can do lots more. It's like a pocket-sized computer, really. It even has games and, more importantly, can read digital files. In fact, I'm transferring the data from the computer right now. Wirelessly. Can you believe that? Athenian tech is just incredible. Sounds useful, Max said as he handed the device back. But what books are you copying anyway? They had known each other for a long time and he had never seen Hedger read a great deal before. Anything that might become helpful to us later on. From plants and potions, a herbalist's handbook, to from a regular fleece to a golden one, a guide to starting a... Maximus laughed and asked, "What do we need those for?" Hedger looked at him seriously. The playfulness had left his eyes. "You do know that we have to start a new life soon, don't you, Max? I mean, we can't just stay here forever." Maximus didn't know what to say to that. Between the tournament coming up and messages of impending doom from the voice, he had not really considered their next move. But he was glad that Hedger had and felt relieved that his friends weren't as short-sighted as himself. "Well, in any case, it sounds like you could take a break. Now come on, Hedge, we have a festival to get to." There was no time that the city of Athens was more active or colorful than during the occasion of the Pan-Athenia festival. Visitors from all over the world would gather to join in the festivities that marked the birth of the great Minervian capital. The streets of the city were filled with waves of people, of various races from numerous countries, all assembling to participate in the events of the festival. As Maximus and the others finally stepped out of the castle, onto the main streets, the first word that came to his mind was messy. Growing up in the barracks, Maximus was always used to a very systematic environment, with very strict commanding officers who ensured the place remained that way. When Maximus had first entered Athens, he had felt that the city would have made those officers jealous. The entire city was perfectly synchronized in every aspect. Not even a light bulb looked out of place, but all that seemed to have been tossed out of the window once the festival began. For one, there were people everywhere. The place was so overcrowded that he kept bumping into people every 10 steps, and it was loud. From an array of vehicles to vendors, a variety of street performers also littered the streets. It was hard to even hear one's own thoughts at the moment. "Where should we go?" Mia wondered. "What?" Max responded, not hearing clearly, as they were right next to an all-dwarf rock band called the Rolling Gnomes. "Where to?" she shouted this time. Maximus pointed to a large structure down the road, where Achilles had told him to meet up at, the Colosseum. The Colosseum was one of the largest structures present there by far. Towering above the rest of the street, the large circular stadium was capable of housing over 10,000 spectators effortlessly. It had over 20 entrances. As they got closer to the giant gray and bronze behemoth, they could see a strange blend of the past and the future. The outer walls of the Colosseum were sculpted with scenes depicting epic battles and other significant chunks of Athenian history. Right beside massive screens which shifted between news coverage from around the festival to a list of upcoming events and quite a few advertisements in between, Maximus and others headed towards Gate 11 through the unending sea of masses where Achilles had told them to meet. Once they reached the gate, the situation did not get any better. There were so many people around that it would be hard to find even an ogre, much less a man. Hedger took to the skies for a better vantage point with no real luck. But after a few minutes, Maximus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see a man in a familiar black hood staring down at him. He knew it was Achilles. It was the same attire he was wearing when they first met. He pointed to the gate and asked them to follow. Achilles had to show a pass at the gate to the centaur on security duty to let them in. It was at least a bit less crowded inside. Achilles did not stop. Instead, he kept walking. After a couple of hallways and a few flights of stairs, they reached an elevator. The 5 of them entered, and Achilles pressed the button for one of the topmost floors as the doors began to close. Once the elevator was in motion, Achilles removed his hood and greeted them. "Enjoying the festival?" he asked in his regular cold and distant tone. "Seeing as how we were constantly cramped between sweaty strangers, I might say that enjoying is not exactly the word," Mia said. "I'll say," added Hedger. "My tail got stepped on twice, and that was when I was gliding." Achilles remained as stone-faced as ever on hearing this. As the elevator doors opened, he put his hood back on and said, "I'm sure you will find the Colosseum more to your liking then." They stepped out. Maximus had to agree with his teacher already. For one thing, there were fewer people on this floor. Sure, it was still crowded, but not a suffocating mob like downstairs. Also, it was easy to see that this floor was classier. The open hall they were standing in had maroon walls with golden embroidery on it. There was a large structure in the middle, shaped like an arc with smiling attendants on one side. There were large ferns placed all along the room, with very comfy-looking couches. The whole area was also well air-conditioned, which really helped, as they had just came in from the scorching sun. There was even a large chandelier sparkling around them. Though Maximus didn't know personally, he imagined that this would be how the lobbies of 5-star hotels looked like. Right then, he felt like he didn't belong there. But it wasn't because of the fancy lobby, it was because of its guests. It was easy to see that the people around came from a very different walk of life. It showed in the fancy clothes they wore, the way they walked, and even in the glares their little group was receiving. It was obvious that all the guests around them came from a much wealthier layer of the society. It made Maximus feel really self-conscious too. Their group were all dressed in the best street clothes they had. Still, he was pretty sure that everything they wore together cost lesser than the shoes of the old man in front of them. "Well, aren't we underdressed?" Hedger murmured. They all looked towards Achilles, unsure of their next move, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he walked over to one of the corridors leading out of the hall and said, "Wait here." Maximus considered following him. He still hadn't told Achilles about the voice's warning, nor had he given him the letter from Commander Leos, but he decided that now was not the time. Disclosing that the city they were standing in might be reduced to ashes seemed like a delicate topic that required a bit more privacy, Maximus thought to himself. So he decided to take a seat on one of the nearby couches with the others. "Am I the only one here who felt more comfortable downstairs in the suffocating crowd?" Hedger asked. "For once I agree with you," Rex said, shifting uncomfortably on the chair that was clearly too small for him. "Not exactly like the trenches, is it? This is the VIP section of the Colosseum. You know, the top floors. Those corridors lead to the best seats in the place," Mia said. Maximus nodded to this. "So this is like the VIP waiting room. Wonder if anyone famous is here." Mia pointed her head to the left and said, "There's someone noteworthy right there." Maximus realized that she was pointing to a group of 5 people. He had noticed them immediately on entry, mainly because it was the first time he was seeing the race in person. But he knew exactly what they were. They all stood at around 7 feet in height, with skin in different shades of blue and green. Their hair was a darker shade that also matched their respective skin colors. Out of their heads appeared webbed, frill-shaped ears. On either side of their necks were 3 horizontal slits that acted as gills. Their upper bodies were strong and muscular, and they had fins on their elbows. They also had webbed hands like those seen on frogs. Their lower halves were another story. 4 out of the 5 of them had long fishtails that were resting on personal transporters called hoverboards, a levitating slab of metal with handles like those of scooters, connected to it for steering. This was the only way most of these creatures could travel on land. After all, mermen belonged to the sea. "Are you talking about the mermen?" Hedger asked, and Mia nodded. "I'm going to take a wild guess here and say the guy in the middle is who you're talking about, the one with the feet," Rex added. Out of the 5 mermen, one alone was not on a hoverboard. In fact, his lower half wasn't even a fishtail. Instead, he had 2 muscular legs covered in green armor made from coral. His skin was a dark shade of blue, and he wore a gold-encrusted coral helmet similar to his armor. In his left hand, he held a long bronze-hooked spear. On his right hand, he wore a massive gauntlet, shaped like a conch. "That's not Admiral Poseidon, is it?" Maximus asked. "What? Of course not, you idiot." Mia said, "You think one of the 3 most powerful gods would be just standing around like that? But he is Poseidon's general, isn't he?" Rex asked, narrowing his eyes. "Triton." Mia nodded to this. "Yep, that's Triton all right. One of the highest officers in the court of Atlantis. Atlantis was Poseidon's capital city, or more specifically, his capital island. Unlike the other gods, Poseidon's domain was not exactly land-based. Instead, he ruled over the Neptune Sea, which was easily the largest water body on the planet. He also maintained the various islands on it, as part of his territory. Of these, Atlantis was the largest. It was also widely known as the Sinking City. This was because the entire island of Atlantis acted as an enormous submarine. The island could be made to sink. It could even be made to move its position according to its needs. It is said that this was done purely by Admiral Poseidon's personal power. Maximus shuddered for a moment, imagining the might of a being that could move an entire island at will. "I gotta say, I'm surprised that Triton is here," Rex said. "From what I've heard, Athena and Poseidon are not on the best of terms." Mia nodded. "They aren't, but a treaty was signed between them a while back, so officially they are at peace. Guess Triton is here to keep up those appearances." "So you think the Admiral is here as well?" Hedger asked. "No way, a few nations send ambassadors to the festivals, but it's rare for the gods themselves to arrive in person." As they spoke, Triton and the other mermen moved away from the lobby, but the area was still filled with interesting characters. "Okay, so let me ask the most obvious question here," Hedger continued. "Why does he have feet? I mean, don't all the mermen and mermaids have dolphin tails?" Maximus was wondering the same thing when a new voice said, "Transformation magic." 2 women had just approached them from their couch, and it was one of them who spoke. The shorter of the 2, the one who had spoken, wore black robes with tiny golden flower designs creeping onto it. She wore ornamental rings on every finger, each with a different colored gemstone. Her hair was jet black, long and wild, with a couple of random braids. Woven in golden strings, she had sharp features and a long nose. She looked like she was in her mid-30s and had a wide grin on her face. Maximus did not know who these women were, but Mia sure did. She jumped off her feet and hugged the lady who spoke and shouted, "Hecuba, I didn't expect to see you here." Then she turned to the second woman. With a nervous bow, she said, "Madam Hex." Madam Hex reacted to Mia with only a slight nod. She was slender and tall, very tall, in fact. She dwarfed Maximus and was easily as tall as Rex. She wore dark purple robes that covered every inch of her body. It was even draped over her head, forming a hood that covered her hair and half her face. Not that her face was visible anyway, as she also wore an ornate, white mask with strands of gold and silver vines around its lips and eye holes. The only part of her body that remained exposed were her hands. She had long, thin fingers and a single silver ring on the middle finger of left hand. The ring had an emblem of a pair of flaming torches forming an X. She also held a long, black furred rodent with yellow spots on it. Maximus recognized it as a polecat. He had even hunted a few of them back in the trenches, but had never seen one with yellow spots or quite this long, or this unhappy for that matter. The polecat seemed irritated and uneasy. It only seemed to get worse as Madame Hex began stroking it. "And I thought we were the weird ones here," Hedger mumbled to Max. Mia turned to them and said, "Guys, this is Hecuba and Madame Hex. They are members of the Hams division. Well, actually, Madame Hex here is the division head." Then she turned towards the two women and said, "These are my friends Max, Hedger, and Rex." They all gave the polite but awkward smile you give when being suddenly introduced to someone new. Hecuba gave a wide grin and Madame Hex nodded again. "Oh dear girl, you know how the Madam dislikes people calling it that," Hecuba said cheerfully. "But I do agree the High Athenian Magical Society is quite a mouthful. But all that aside, how are you, my dear?" "Can't complain," Mia said, "but I am surprised to see you here. Especially you, madam. Didn't think you were the festival type." Mia still sounded nervous while addressing Madame Hex, which Max found strange as Mia was not someone who got rattled easily. "Oh, she's not. But dear Athena always gets us great tickets, and I convinced her that it would be rather impolite to waste them. Besides, she could use a bit of time outside that tent we call HQ." Madame Hex seemed least bothered by the conversation going on, even though she was the topic of discussion. Instead, she was staring at Maximus with great intensity. Max was starting to get uncomfortable from the stare the purple-robed woman was giving him, and just when he thought it couldn't get any more awkward, the polecat jumped from Madame Hex's arms and started sniffing him. "I think he likes you," Hedger commented. The polecat turned and began to hiss at the sprite. "It's a she," Hecuba explained. "My apologies." Hedger said, unsure of why he was apologizing to an animal, but the polecat accepted it. She turned and began to sniff Maximus again, and then more specifically his sword. "Now, Gale, you know it's rude to sniff other people like that," Hecuba said, but Gale the polecat ignored her. Finally, Madame Hex had to move towards it, for the rodent to reluctantly jump back into her arms. But somehow, Madame Hex's gaze on him had still not shifted. A few moments later, Maximus finally saw Achilles approaching them, and was glad that this awkward conversation would be over soon. But just as Achilles reached them, the smile disappeared from Hecuba's face. Instead, her lips went tight, and her eyes were filled with loathing towards Achilles. "You," she spat out. It was clear from her tone that she knew exactly who was under the black hood. "My queen," Achilles responded respectfully, but Hecuba seemed to have transformed from the kind, smiling woman to someone in a feral rage. It might have been Max's imagination, but he was sure that even her nails were getting longer. "Do not address me such, you cur," she snarled. "I was a mother before I was a queen." Achilles stood there unresponsive to this insult, but Hecuba did not seem to be letting it go. "Enough," said Madame Hex. Her feminine voice had a very dense feel to it, and an unnaturally echoing tone as well. But that one word really was enough, as it seemed to have left Hecuba speechless. Finally, Hecuba calmed herself and turned away from Achilles and back to Mia with a forced smile. "Well, my dear, it really was lovely seeing you, but I'm afraid we must be going now, to find our seat." With that, the two strange women left along with their pet polecat, but even while leaving, Madame Hex turned to give Maximus one final look which sent a chill down his spine. Once they had departed, they all turned to Achilles expecting an explanation, but Achilles did not give any. Instead, he said, "Come on," and started walking down a corridor. As they were walking, when Max was sure Achilles was not within earshot, he asked Mia, "What was all that about?" Mia paused before responding and then said, "Well, a long time ago Hecuba used to be a queen, the queen of Troy to be precise, and the mother of Hector." And just like that, no further explanations were needed. They stopped before a set of huge double doors with the number 7 written on it. They entered to find a spacious and well-lit room. The room had the same maroon walls as the rest of the floor, and a few decorative vases and plants here and there. To the left side of the room, there was a large screen and a state-of-the-art jukebox which was playing classical piano music. To the right side of the room was a table with an assortment of refreshments including snacks, a fully roasted lamb, and a bottle of champagne immersed in a bucket of ice. In the middle of the room were a set of 10 large and comfy-looking pushback chairs. Even Rex could easily fit into them. Soon all of them were facing the front of the room. There was a large opening where the front wall should have been. The floor extended out into a balcony a bit. There was a large glass window that took up the entire wall and gave the perfect view of the inside of the Colosseum. Maximus realized that they were in a private viewing box. He had no doubt it belonged to the person standing in front of them, Odysseus. He wasn't alone either. He seemed to be in a heated discussion with Icarus at the moment. "Do you expect me to greet him with flowers?" Icarus said angrily to the general. "I don't expect you to even look at him. In fact, I want you to stay as far away from him as possible. By the gods, Icarus, we cannot just refuse to host him because of your personal grudges." Icarus was about to keep arguing, but he had just seen all of the men. Instead, he said, "As you wish, General Odysseus." Maximus imagined him gritting his teeth under his mask as he said this. "If you don't mind, then I will be leaving now, to be as far away from him as possible, according to your wish," Icarus said. Giving Achilles a slight nod, he headed to the door, which slammed shut behind him. Odysseus finally turned to greet them. Achilles had taken off his hooded jacket. He turned to Odysseus with a questioning look. "Yes, I suppose you should know as well. We have a very special last-minute guest for the festival," Odysseus said grimly. "Apollo. Apollo, the sun god. The honor accorded to the ruler of the country of Sol, as well as the title of the sun god, was not enough to describe this particular entity. He was also the god of music, archery, poetry, prophecy, and much more. Often regarded as the very embodiment of perfection, he and his sister Artemis, the goddess of hunting, were said to be among Zeus's favorites. Maximus had heard a lot about the sun god while growing up, as he was not media shy. Maximus remembered Kayla once calling Apollo the god of hunks back in the trenches. It had made him unreasonably jealous at the time. Still, he had heard a few stories about Apollo recently, which greatly contradicted the sun god's public image. Not only had he burned Icarus in battle so badly that he now had to wear a full-body suit just to stay alive, but back in the Trojan War, it was the sun god who had shot Achilles on the heel, inflicting the wound that cost him his leg. But the world did not know this. According to history, it was Paris, a prince of Troy, who had made the shot and killed Achilles. Maximus knew that the only reason Apollo hadn't taken credit for this act was because Zeus had forbidden the gods from personally entering the war. But this also made Maximus wonder how Apollo could disobey the god-king's orders right under his nose. If Achilles felt any rage or frustration on hearing this news, he did not express it. He merely nodded to Odysseus and continued staring out of the window, looking out over the arena. Odysseus then turned to the others with a smile and said, "Well, welcome all of you. I rarely have guests in this humble abode. This is my private box in the Colosseum, box 7. Do make yourselves at home." "Perks of being general, huh?" Rex commented. Odysseus chuckled at this. "Oh yes, as general I was allowed to choose any of the VIP boxes for myself. I chose number 7 as homage to my old brigade, the Omega 7. Odysseus left shortly after, as he had matters to attend to regarding the opening ceremony. Maximus decided that it was the perfect opportunity to hand over the letter Leos had given him, while others were busy stuffing themselves from the buffet. Achilles, on the other hand, had taken a seat already. So he quickly went over to Achilles and said, "I have something for you. It's from Commander Leos." He handed the letter over to Achilles, who read the letter immediately. He then took out his lighter and burned the piece of paper as instructed and closed his eyes to start meditating again. "I read the letter," Maximus blurted out, not sure on how else to start. Achilles opened his eyes and looked at him quizzically. "I know, I shouldn't have," Max blabbered. "But you were gone. I was confused and needed some answers." Achilles raised his hand to silence him. Then he asked, "And did you get your answers?" Though his teacher didn't sound mad, Maximus wished he did because he felt a bit ashamed for reading the letter. However, he reminded himself that he had something more important to say. "Look, I know I shouldn't have, but still. Well, when I read the letter I had a vision." Maximus had already invented an explanation. The existence of the voice was still kept a secret from his friends, on its strict orders. A decision Max hoped wouldn't be a lapse in judgment in the long run. But for now, mysterious visions was what he was going with. Achilles seemed interested in this new information in any case. "What did you see?" he asked. "It was kind of hard to tell, but there was a storm, only it was hollow in a way, with the rains and winds avoiding the center. And I think that's where Ares' forces are hiding." Achilles seemed surprised by this. "Maximus, think clearly. Are you sure that is what you saw?" he persisted. Max nodded. "Something like that would require an enormous amount of magic, and Ares holds no power over weather manipulation," said Achilles. "Maybe one of his generals, then." "I've heard Deimos is quite a magician," Maximus speculated. "Deimos is an illusionist. He is nowhere near competent enough for something of this scale," Achilles replied. Maximus knew he was right. He had heard Deimos was a specialist in illusion and fire magic back in the barracks. Even he did not seem capable of creating a storm large enough to hide an entire army, but there was something peculiar in the expression on Achilles' face. "Do you know who could be responsible then?" Maximus asked. Achilles got up and headed for the door. Before he left, he turned to Maximus and said, "I have a hunch, but pray to whatever god is listening that my hunch is wrong." This has been a chapter from Book 2 of the new World Odyssey Series, The Legions of Athena. Links to the books in the bio. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this chapter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you in the next chapter.